Hi, folks. Welcome.
Good morning. It's very unusual for us to say good morning when we do SDS Thursday. And it's not even Thursday, it's Tuesday. So it's all slightly out of the ordinary. As you know, we are running our evening event today in the afternoon because on Thursday it's a bank holiday and we're celebrating the Platinum Jubilee of Her Majesty the Queen. But we also were interested to see whether people can make it in the afternoon, because as you know, we've started SDS Thursdays over 2 years ago during the first lockdown. As soon as the first lockdown hit us, we started these Thursdays. And it was logical to do it in the evening because everyone spent time at home in the evening. We couldn't go anywhere. Restaurants were closed, cinemas were closed, theaters were closed. And more or less, the only way to meet people was on Zoom. And now the situation has changed. So we would love to know your opinion, whether 7 o'clock in the evening is still a good time for you, or you would prefer us to meet in the afternoon, or I don't know, early evening, anything you think might be relevant and most suitable for you. If you could put it in the comments in the chat box, that will help us to plan for the future. Because we've noticed we've run a couple of events in the afternoon and actually more people turned up during the day than over the evening. So things have changed. So if you could just put a line in the chat box to say what time is best for you. Or maybe you would say, we would like you to change it from time to time so we can have an opportunity to do it at different times. So anything you think is relevant, just put in the chat box. That would be very, very helpful. While they're still gathering, as always, I would like to share my screen with you and take you onto SDS website, especially for those who haven't come to our Thursdays before and haven't seen this shared screen. So on SDS website, you can find a lot of useful information straight on the homepage. So first of all, you look at upcoming events, and today's event will be dedicated to the workshop which we're doing on the 10th of June, Integrated CBT for Hoarding Disorder. And as I mentioned, it is now classified as a diagnostic category. So we are running it on the 10th of June. All our modules of integrated CBT for common life challenges run between 12 and 2. Okay, so this is the topic which we will be discussing today. Now I'm very happy to introduce my co-director, Paul Grantham, who will be a presenter on the workshop on hoarding. And today we want to talk about the problem and what makes it prominent, what makes it interesting, and why Paul has decided to design a whole workshop around it. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks very much, Julia, and welcome everybody.
So, Paul, let's start with the question of definition, as always. So, what is a hoarding disorder, and how is it different to, I don't know, we all know people who, for example, collect things, you know, or people who just like to have all sorts of memorabilia around them, you know, photographs, some keepsakes and things like that. So at what point it stops being collecting and becomes hoarding?
Right. Well, that's a great question, Julia, in terms of starting off. And I think that some of the confusion that's actually around hoarding is actually related in part to its confusion with collecting. And I think it's also, unfortunately, sometimes sort of confused with what is commonly called squalor. As well, and actually the whole thing is quite different, although there are not surprisingly some overlaps. So in brief, and obviously we'll open this up in a lot more detail on the actual day. The primary issue here with hoarding is that it's an activity which is going to interfere with functioning. So the long and the short of it is that basically you can't live your life normally because of primarily the amount of objects that you've actually got around you with. And in fact, one of the common sort of functional definitions of hoarding is that basically rooms can't actually be used for their primary purpose. So whole areas of the home are shut off. And it probably would be fair to say that in extreme instances, you will find that individuals end up having to use some spare space that's available to them. So they can't even, for example, they can't even get to their bed very readily. So rooms can't be used for their purpose. I think it's probably fair to say that generally speaking, when we're looking at collecting, there's first of all an issue of selection. So in that respect, people tend to collect specific things. Hoarding is much more generalized, and although there are some individuals who sort of hoard certain types of objects more than others, paperwork of any type would be one example of that. Generally speaking, with hoarding, that acquisition and retention is quite generalized. It's not about a specific object or type of objects. And I think the other thing to bear in mind for most people who collect is that part of the issue of collecting is organizing those particular objects in some particular way, whether it's to classify them or whether it's about presenting them to the world in a particular way, but order is a component to that. And undoubtedly, with regards to hoarding, that's not the case at all. But I think that, and of course, the other thing, this is a very important thing to mention, is that although it's not integral to collecting, I think it's quite common with collecting to have some sort of ongoing exchange. So for example, if I wish to buy a new object, but maybe I don't quite know where to put it, it's much more common with collecting that I will actually dispose of another item in order to actually make room for it. And that certainly doesn't happen with hoarding. What happens with hoarding at best is that basically piles of things are moved around. They're moved from one room to another or from different places within a particular room or whatever. So, yeah, in that respect, it's sort of quite separate from collecting. I think, however, for me, this issue about its interference with functioning is probably the thing that is, I think, the biggest concern, and in a strange way, is one of the reasons why specifically I wanted to say a little bit about this particular topic, because hoarding is it's in many ways, I think, a secret problem. And I think it's a secret problem because, generally speaking, people that hoard and have problems with hoarding tend on the whole not to bring themselves to the attention of practitioners. So it's much more likely that if someone is going to seek help, the single most common route to that is probably from statutory services. So I don't know, a professional will have visited and been concerned and will strongly encourage the person to go and seek help, or they might be strongly encouraged to seek help from family members, for example. And in some instances, although I do wish to emphasize these are extreme instances, and I wouldn't want to suggest all hoarding is like this, They may well be mandated to do this because there is a health and safety issue around with the amount of hoarding that they're actually engaging in. But generally speaking, people don't come along voluntarily for help. So they tend to get sent. So that for me means that, not surprisingly, only a very small proportion of people with this as a problem end up being seen. But, sorry, maybe more accurately, I should say, they only a small proportion of these people end up being seen for that problem. But I am utterly convinced that everybody who is here today, for instance, will have a certain proportion of clients who are hoarding, but that's not the problem that they come along for. So I think it's quite useful to have some understanding of the symbiotic relationship between hoarding and, for want of a better term, emotional and cognitive problems that people might actually have. And I want to start off with what I think is probably the most common example of that, and also one which I hope that people have the most sympathy with, which is, I'm sure a lot of folks will be working with people with low mood or who are depressed. And one of the things that we know, just probably from our own experience of maybe feeling down, is that when we are feeling depressed, we just don't get our act together in order to organize our environment. I don't want to suggest, by the way, that hoarding is purely a product of depression. That it appears to be a separate mechanism, but in terms of understanding it, I think we can most easily understand how, when we're feeling down, we don't organize our environment as we would do. But here's the most important thing that I want to emphasize. As a result of not organizing our environment, we actually end up feeling worse. In other words, the behavioral effects of that actually end up creating a negative feedback loop, and we feel even worse. If I'm someone who is very anxious, for instance, and I am feeling out of control, having a physical environment around me which is out of control is equally something which simply compounds the particular problem that I have. I think that it has enormous implications for maintaining, for example, problems like social anxiety. We know that a very simple touchstone question to actually ask some people to provide us with an entry route into hoarding is whether they actually feel comfortable with anybody ever coming around to where they live. And generally speaking, hoarders tend to be quite reluctant about that, or in many instances are quite reluctant, because, well, there's an interesting issue here about awareness, but I think people commonly have enough awareness to know that there's an issue here. So in a peculiar way, hoarding helps to maintain social anxiety problems. It helps to maintain loneliness as well for people. And the other thing is that it's intricately tied up, as I'll probably have a chance to say certainly later on now, and certainly on the training day, is intricately tied up with, for want of a better term, decision-making and organizational skills. So in a strange way, we know, for example, that certain decision-making problems that folks have can lead them to be more prone to hoarding. But equally, the more you hoard, the more it actually undermines whatever decision-making confidence that you've actually got in the first place. So in a strange way, it ends up becoming evidence of my incompetence, or my belief that I'm actually incompetent. So there's a number of ways it actually operates here, and why I think that, to be honest with you, even if you don't, you're not seeing people who have been referred with this particular problem, I think that we actually have a duty to explore whether it's actually present, simply because it will compound other problems that people actually have got. And I think this is the final point I would make on this, there is an addictive quality to hoarding. So please don't start off from the assumption that as someone's, for example, as someone's mood automatically rises, then actually the hoarding problem will disappear automatically. There is no evidence that that is commonly the case. In fact, in a peculiar way, the addictive nature of hoarding helps to keep the low mood going, independent of all the work that we might be doing in terms of trying to work with someone's depression.
Interesting. Thank you. There were several questions I wanted to ask as you were talking. The first thing I wanted to check, well, obviously, as you mentioned, people don't often of their own will come to see the therapist and say, I suffer from hoarding. So there is certain social stigma attached to it, as we were discussing about many of these conditions which we discussed already, like jealousy, for example, or anger. There's certain social stigma attached to it. And the second thing is about this degree of hoarding, as you described, because when we talk of hoarding, we always imagine dwelling when you have difficulties open the door and enter the house. But is it always that extreme? Because we all know friends and relatives, and sometimes guilty of that ourselves, that when we tidy up in one room, we have one room where everything goes. And we've seen people like that, and that is the room where you can't open the door and enter, when the rest of the apartment or house look relatively okay. Would that be classified as hoarding, or it's not? So
okay. So can I just pick up on the first point that you make first of all, which was about the shame element as being a major obstacle to seeking help. I just probably want to say that actually, although that does exist, ironically, there's actually a bigger obstacle, which is lack of awareness. And it'll probably only be fair to say this, that I would almost say, very much like a lot of folks who have substance addiction problems, they will often not identify this as a problem, or say other people think it's a problem, but I don't think it's as big. People exaggerate it, and so although there is some shame element there, I think it's also important to recognise there's a big issue here about problem identification, which I'll come back to in a minute. Coming back to the question about actually how, sorry, yeah.
Can I interrupt you, because Georgie is asking very interesting question related to what we've just discussed. She says, people do not seek help, not just because of the stigma, but also due to fear that someone is going to try to make them get rid of stuff. So that's
I think that's I mean, I don't think it's the primary issue. The primary issue is I'm anxious about anything being touched. I'm going to pretend this is not a problem. I convince myself it's not a problem because there's, as we will be talking about, there's all sorts of amazingly convincing self-talk that people engage in to maintain their hoarding. But I think that once someone has had contact with services, or once the possibility of receiving help is identified, I think that Georgia's very right on that. I think it's a very common concern, and indeed, what I think is interesting about it is that either because intervention occurs at a crisis point, so there's an urgency involved in it, or because I think it's just simply misunderstood. It's very common indeed for practitioners to take a didactic approach to this, to basically, say, you've got to give up, or to slightly alter an old-fashioned phrase that was once used in connection with not using drugs, just say no. And actually, it's not that simple and straightforward. So for a lot of folks who are hoarders, the idea that someone's going to make them give up their things is a big worry, in exactly the same way that one might anticipate, for example, someone who has a substance dependency to go somewhere and be denied access to their substance and the anxieties that might be around with that. I think that's quite right, yes.
So coming back to my second question about the degree of hoarding, and whether just hoarding in one room out of the house is still hoarding.
I think there's two ways of approaching this. I think the first thing to say is that, I think it's always useful to start off with that question: is this interfering with your ability to do your life or to live your life, really? And there's a number of ways of entering into a conversation and a dialogue with a client in order to ascertain that and to explore that with the client. So that's one thing. So in a peculiar way, just to come back to the original example that you gave, if someone has one particular room which is not usable, but which contains things that they really wish they could access, but they can't find out where the heck they actually are, and this is creating other problems, then yes, that's still worth looking at. So one way of approaching this is, how much does it interfere with your life, basically? The other way of approaching it is to recognize that it has a key maintenance role to play with regards to other types of problem. And that in a peculiar way, it's a little bit like, there are certain things that we do or don't do which help to maintain emotional problems. So if to take a simple example, if you look at reduced activity levels, for instance, when someone's depressed, in one way it's a product of being depressed, but on the other hand, it actually feeds and maintains the depression. So what I would say is if someone is presenting with another problem, and particularly an emotional problem of low mood, self-esteem, poor self-confidence, maybe they've got other difficulties that are actually around where they're not really addressing particular issues that they need to, and they feel out of control, maybe. So I can think of some people who I might have worked with who have got health anxiety problems, but also happen, we discover, to hoard to some degree. And both of those particular things are concerned with feeling out of control, difficulties tolerating uncertainty, and so on and so forth. It would make logical sense to actually directly address it. So I wouldn't just use that criteria, basically, of how many rooms are out of action. It's not like there's that hard and fast rule. Some people are able to contain it more than others can, although there's a general tendency with this for it to spread. But some people can contain it, but nonetheless, it's still worth addressing if it has that negative impact.
Thank you. We have fantastic comments in the chat box, but I want to move on to the next question before we reflect upon those. Is hoarding a new problem? Has it existed historically, or it's something what we are facing now?
Right. Well, this is, I think, a very interesting issue because it sort of connects in with a general interest of mine. Hoarding, has been around ever since people have had somewhere to store things, and when there is a lack of availability all the time. So we know that people have hoarded food, for instance, for centuries, if not millennia, and then that moved on to people hoarding objects that they perceived as having value. What we now see as hoarding, or what we often perceive as hoarding, is not about simply keeping objects which have clear value or clear use. In fact, a large proportion of objects that people actually collect do not have any intrinsic value or any intrinsic use at all. And that is probably the thing that's changed, and it's changed in the 20th century, and it's been particularly marked since the end of the Second World War. And my personal view on this is that this is another one of those products of consumerism. On another training I do, I talk about the existence of upward and downward social comparisons that we make as human beings, and how consumerism has encouraged us to make more upward social comparisons, which is just in brief here for folks who are not familiar with this, which is strongly associated with poorer mental health. And I sort of see hoarding as it currently exists as a problem as fitting into that particular model, really. So we have an enormous range of items which historically would never have been available to actually keep. I mean, let me just take two examples of quite common ones, which would never have existed even, I don't know, probably, to be honest with you, maybe even not 40 years ago. So things like takeaway menus, for instance. It is quite staggering, I think, today, when so much takeaways are actually ordered off the net, that there are still people who hoard paper copies of menus. Folks who, for example, will go to a cafe and where there is open access to sweetener sachets, and they will take some sweetener sachets and take them back home. I mean, and this is, can I say, a common way of thinking with hoarding, just in case, just in case. And that sort of just in case argument underlies a large, not all, I mean, there's other reasons as well, but it underlies a large proportion of items which are both acquired and then kept. Because don't forget that for hoarding to occur, you typically have to acquire in the first place. So there's an acquisition as well as a holding and a non-disposal element to this whole particular issue. So I would argue very strongly that it's a phenomenon which is a consumerist phenomenon. It's another great way in which our consumerist society creates psychological problems for people. And you know, at the end of the day, hoarding did exist in the past, but it was of a very, very different nature.
When you were talking about it, I'm a great fan of the Big Bang Theory, and I remembered Howard Wolowitz and how he and his mother had a whole drawer in the kitchen full of single-use tomato ketchup packs. So yeah, it's happened. Personally, I mean, I'll tell you my personal view. I do believe that probably it served some evolutionary purpose in the past.
Yes.
I remember the generation of my grandparents. They were keeping everything, even bent nails, you know, or a piece of string. It might come useful, but they lived in a time when everything was difficult to get hold of, and they kept all these things just in case. And I noticed that some of my hoarding sort of instincts come from there, but maybe in their generation it made sense to keep pieces of string. For me, it probably doesn't make sense, but I sometimes still do it. Would you agree?
Well, no, totally. But I mean, the interesting thing about this is we see this with so many problems, don't we? You know, we know that the fight-flight mechanism was extremely useful from an evolutionary perspective in terms of running away from hairy mammoths. Whether we should be feeling the same way when we meet a new person at a party is a totally different issue. And I think you're quite right. There are evolutionary predispositions that we have, which had a very strong, you know, pre-existing underpinning to them, which was very functional. But the world has changed, and yet we still have this inclination for those particular responses. I think you're totally right on that.
Thank you. How would you describe I think there was a question in the chat, prevalence of hoarding? Are there any figures you can share?
Yep, there are. And part of the issue here is that it does vary according to where you look and what you're going to use as a definition. But the general consensus that's around at the moment is we're talking somewhere between about 4.5% and 6% of the population. Yeah.
I'm just reading the comments in the chat. I can't throw away the rubber bands. The New York Times is delivered wrapped in sometimes. Yeah, I mean, we probably all have a little bit of it in some way, and that's why I'm so interested in definitions in terms of how, when it's hoarding and when we're just untidy or attached to something. I mean, lots of people probably can reflect upon it about their wardrobes or, you know, closets. How many garments we keep in case we lose weight, you know, and we keep them for 20 years and still still we're actually much farther away from them, but we still keep them. So we obviously all struggle with it in some way. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, no, totally. But I think that, you know, part of this is the degree, and I will come back to the same issue again, which is whether it interferes with functioning. I remember working with a woman who the reason why she had sought help was that she was in conflict with her husband, conflict with her ex-husband, whom she had already divorced, and the financial settlement basically involved them selling the family home. But unfortunately, she still used, even though she hadn't lived there now for probably about 3 or 4 years, there were 2 particular rooms in the family home, which were still being used to keep her clothes in. Which she'd never moved out from the family home, and that became a sticking point. Now, strictly speaking, before that produced conflict with her husband, it wasn't, strictly speaking, a hoarding problem. But because of the change in circumstances, it had become a problem. Yeah.
Well, Carla says exactly that. What I find really tricky is to help a couple when one partner is a hoarder and the other one is suffering from it, but hoarder doesn't see at all how it is a problem. So clearly that can be coming up in couples therapy, family therapy as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say something briefly to Carla on this. I appreciate that it presents itself in that particularly stark way. What I would probably encourage you to do is to both firstly recognize and then work with the couple to see that this is not fundamentally different from any other characteristic that one person in the partnership has. So, for example, if you had, just as an example, I don't know, one partner wanting to have meals at the table and the other partner always wanting to have meals in front of the TV, and couldn't see why this was a problem for the other person, how do you deal with that, really? And, you know, this in a way, sort of to some degree, comes back to the question of partly about tolerance and acceptance, and how you help a couple achieve a shared tolerant view of each other's different values. And secondly, again, whether this is just a problem actually for the partner or whether it actually creates other problems as well. And if it creates other problems as well, then it in a sense, it moves it out from the personalized framing of the problem, which often exists, I think, in couples work.
And Carla just says, yes, they can't use dining table when they have guests. Because of the hoarding problem. Well, it all very logically brings us to a question of helping these people and what you are going to cover in your 2-hour workshop, because actually, I think it's Georgia already mentioned that this link to addiction means that probably motivational interviewing could be helpful for these people. What kind of therapeutic approaches would you recommend?
Right. Couple of things I would say to start off with, which obviously I'll be going into detail on the actual day. We're pretty clear now in having an understanding of about what factors tend to contribute to this as a particular problem, but there is some degree of variability on these factors between people. So the first point I want to make is that assessment is really important in this situation. You can't, you know, on the one hand, you sort of know what sort of ingredients might make up the problem, but you can't assume that all the ingredients are there. So that's why the assessment is important. That's then going to lead to a formulation. Secondly, basically, as she's quite rightly highlighted, motivation tends to be an issue here. And, you know, MI plays a role with this, but there are some other elements within it that I think you need to be aware of to broaden out the whole question of engagement. One of the things, just to give you a very simple example of this, there's actually an assessment tool that's around, which asks individuals to rate their degree of hoarding according to different photographs with different levels of clutter, basically. And one of the things that's quite interesting about this is that the very act of an individual taking this selection of photographs to home and then marking particular rooms against these particular selected photographs is one of the most useful things to actually create insight and engagement. Because if you're sort of talking about this as a problem only, very often people just do not see it. Whereas visually, when they have a compare and contrast mechanism available to them, it makes it much easier. I'm not suggesting it's the only thing that can be done on motivation. It's not, and MI has a big role to play. I guess all I'm trying to say is there are other things in addition to MI which are going to be important to address. And I would say, to varying degrees, this is going to be central to everybody you're going to be working with. I mean, obviously some people are less poorly motivated than others, but this is not that there is a motivational issue that's around with this problem, not just in terms of initial engagement, but also in terms of subsequent ongoing work as well. And because of that, and because of that motivational issue, I think generally speaking, and staying with the substance or the addiction metaphor here, there's an argument to be made that the entry route into this problem almost invariably is useful to start with a harm reduction strategy. So there are different ways in which you and the client can actually identify therapeutic targets rather than being open-ended, which tends to scare clients and often leads to greater engagement. Whereas if we can actually start off looking at, for instance, short-term therapeutic goals. For example, being able to get to my bed, for instance, in my bedroom, would be one particular. We'll leave everything else, but we're going to try and create a corridor there. And there's other things. There's other things as well. Like there's obviously, if you've got fire risks around with stuff, then that becomes a priority and so on. But I'll be going through that in quite a bit of detail. There is a big emphasis on the dealing with this as a problem through the use of exposure and response prevention. So for that particular reason, a lot of that work is actually done within session. Individuals will commonly bring piles of clutter in a bag to work with during sessions, and I'll be saying a little bit about how those are actually used and what the advantages are of approaching it in that particular way. We'll also be looking at the use of some self-control strategies, and that appears to be particularly important over the question of acquisition, because there's obviously no point in, for instance, encouraging people to dispose of if actually they're simply going to buy more new stuff, basically. And when you look at how stuff is commonly bought, it is bought as a way of regulating mood, or putting it very bluntly, people buy stuff when they're feeling a bit down. This is retail therapy writ mad, basically. So we'll be looking at that, everything from delayed purchase to self-calming techniques that people can actually use. And we'll have a clear protocol for disposal as well. We now know that a lot of people with hoarding problems have certain cognitive issues with regards to both memory, decision-making, and problem solving. So we know that, for instance, and we're not sure why this is, but we know, for instance, that people who hoard often have greater difficulties with creating what are called salient visual cues for recall. So when you or I are thinking of where something is in the house, we will have a particular process we will go through to identify that, which to varying degrees is likely to be correct. We know, however, that a lot of hoarders have a very poor skill in this particular area, and not surprisingly, that feeds into low confidence as well. So that's why individuals often feel that they can't make a decision about getting rid of stuff because they don't have confidence in their own decision making. So we'll be looking at some work that's been done as well there that you can use straight away, which is about improving confidence in decision making and also looking at problem solving skills. This whole issue of both impulsive purchase, or might not even be purchase, incidentally, impulsive acquisition, and its connection with the sense of using it as a form of emotional soothing is also tied up, I think, as well with the question of disposal. So generally speaking, people feel very anxious indeed at the prospect of disposal, which is one of the reasons why we will be looking at how you can apply some dialectical behavior therapy strategies here, specifically in terms of managing intense emotions. And intense emotions, by the way, can be very strong indeed for a lot of folks with this. And then, of course, we've got a whole range of unhelpful thinking and some underlying mechanisms, which, interestingly enough, have cropped up in previous modules of this integrated CBT for common life challenges. We know that it's not unusual for hoarders to also be perfectionists. So we will be revisiting briefly some of that particular work on how to tackle perfectionism. And we also know, probably not surprisingly, that procrastination also underlies a lot of retention of objects as well. So I'll be taking you through a whole range of not just practical strategies that you can use to work with folks who hoard, but also a structure in which to actually do it as well.
Interesting. I was listening to you, Paul, and it crossed my mind, just as a thing to think about. Hoarding in many ways reminded me of excessive eating, and it's sort of obesity, hoarding. Somehow in my mind they are quite linked, you know, emotional eating, difficulties with saying no to stopping and things like that. So that'll be something interesting to think about. And also we had a question in the chat box about how to differentiate between hoarding and OCD. So I'm not asking you now, but probably something to just reflect upon during your workshop that could be useful. And there are other wonderful questions, which what I will do is copy them and send them to you again to try to probably reflect upon during the 2 hours, so you'll have a little bit more time, although I know you always struggle with time as well, but that would be useful. I just wanted to mention this point, which rings very important to me as well. Katy is saying, on the other side of consumerism, it actually encourages throwing away things rather than mend them, and we become a throwaway society. And I think what's very interesting about it, that on one hand it's sort of the antithesis of hoarding, you would think, but I know plenty of people who, while they buy new things, they do not get rid of the old things. So they might have several vacuum cleaners standing in their utility room or in their bedroom, not to mention telephones, laptops, computers, which we buy new ones but still keep the old ones. So this is like throwaway plus hoarding, and we become just a society of things, aren't we?
I think in many ways we are caught up in a conflict between consumerism and our natural evolutionary inclination to hold on to. So frequently what happens is that we buy more, but we don't dispose of. Because, you know, all sorts of reasons. I mean, I'll say a little bit more about this on the actual day, but I mean, there are some instances where things are kept hold of simply because they look nice, or we think they have intrinsic beauty. Some things are related to sort of possible instrumental value. I say possible because it's usually accompanied by the belief that maybe this might be useful in the future, which is a bit like your string example. I mean, it's not, and that's an interesting point, of course, is that people rarely retain these things attached to a time scale. They don't say, I need to use this tomorrow. It's always about, I might possibly need this at some unspecified point in the future. And the final thing, which I think is a particular issue for some folks, is objects with sentimental value. So people to keep all objects that have some emotional connection. And indeed, there are some folks who then add to that by collecting not one object attached to, I don't know, to a birthday party, but all objects that are attached to the particular birthday party, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Well, I think we can all recognize ourselves in that a little bit. I have real difficulties getting rid of birthday cards or Christmas cards for that very reason. It sort of seems it holds sentimental value, but then again, they grow year by year, and you don't know where is that stopping point. So I think that the workshop on hoarding will be fascinating. I'm really looking forward to it. So again, it is, correct me if I'm wrong, is it 10th of June? Yeah.
Oh dear, you're asking me.
I know. I've just.
Yes, it's on the 10th. It's on the 10th at midday.
Yes, at midday, 10th of June, early bird discount is still available. I have put the link to the chat box, and I promise all the questions which we didn't discuss, I will send to Paul, and he will try to touch upon them at least briefly during his workshop. So thank you very much for joining us today at midday, and I hope you'll have a lovely bank holiday weekend, whether you're doing Platinum Jubilee or not. Just take this time to enjoy yourselves. And as always, you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and we will see you very soon, hopefully next week on Hoarding event. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Take care, folks. Look after yourselves. Take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Look after yourselves.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.